Wow, what an amazing turnout. Yeah, this is pretty mind-blowing for me. For those of you who don't know me, I am Josh Peck, and thank you for joining us here. Today we're going to be talking about extra-dimensional UFOs. Let's see if it's going to come on the screen here. Exploring the extra-dimensional hypothesis of UFOs from a biblical and scientific perspective. A lot of the world is looking at the UFO phenomenon from what's called the ETH, or extraterrestrial hypothesis. And I think us as Christians can look at it from the EDH, extra-dimensional hypothesis, and actually get a better view of what is happening. Nope, no problem. All right, so we'll get this up on the screen and we can get started. Yeah, I guess I got to entertain you for a little while.
What's your story?
Well, that is the first part, so we can start there. Or is it? Okay, well, while we're figuring all this out, again, I am Josh Peck. I was born and raised in a Baptist environment, very loving people. Had a lot of good foundational Bible teachings that I grew up with, but there were certain things that weren't answered that I had a lot of questions about. One of the biggest one was aliens. I wanted to know how they fit into the Bible, and if at all, and not trying to say anything bad about the church that I was in or anything. They just didn't have an answer and didn't know how to answer that question. So even at 12 years old, I remember asking the pastor, well, what about aliens? And the only real kind of answer I would get was, well, they're demonic. And so I would ask, well, how do we know that? You know, where does it say that in the Bible? Well, Josh, you just got to take it on faith. Hey, there we go. So it didn't take long for me to learn to not ask. And I think that's where a lot of Christians are today, because the church, and not saying anything bad about the church in itself, I think that they're just not, a lot of them aren't equipped to answer some of these difficult questions. Because UFOs is a very difficult subject. I mean, you got to do research into a lot of strange areas, especially when we have shows like Ancient Aliens and stuff that are providing the world with an answer that a lot of people seem to like. So how do we come up against that? Well, the first thing here, the ETH versus the EDH, I talked a little bit about that already. Extraterrestrial hypothesis, that is basically saying UFOs and their pilots, or at least the otherworldly ones, come from another planet, basically, instead of some other answer. So shows like Ancient Aliens and most of the world subscribe to the ETH, the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Most of the science fiction movies involving aliens that comes out all the time today will be from that perspective. But there's another one, a lesser known one, a less popular one, but I think a more accurate one, called the EDH, extra-dimensional hypothesis. More Christians, I think, than secular people are going to subscribe to this if they handle the subject at all, because it has more to do with spirituality than anything else. But the other side of that is New Age philosophy has also grabbed a hold of that. So we're kind of being attacked from all angles here. Now, actually, a well-known UFO researcher, Jacques Vallée, he wrote 5 arguments against the extraterrestrial origin of unidentified flying objects in support of the EDH. Now, Jacques Vallée, he's a very well-known UFO researcher. He's not looking at this from a biblical view or a Christian view not that we know of, but he looks at the research and lets the research speak for itself. And when you do that, you time and time again, you come to the EDH. Now, we don't have time to go through all 5 of these, but I can just kind of go through some of them or do it briefly. But the first one, unexplained close encounters are far more numerous than required for any physical survey of the Earth. One of the biggest hypotheses on why aliens are visiting Earth is to survey the Earth, maybe use it for materials, take soil samples, all that. But when you actually look at the sheer number of how many people are having close encounters and legitimate ones, ones that have some kind of evidence to it. It's way too much for that. The second one here, the humanoid body structure of the alleged aliens is not likely to have originated on another planet and is not biologically adapted to space travel. This one, again, he doesn't come at this from a biblical standpoint, so this has more to do with like evolution and things. But it still is something we can use if we're talking to somebody who is an atheist or is more naturalistic and believes in evolution. We can say, well, if evolution is true and you believe these aliens evolved on another planet, why do they look so similar to us? What are the chances of that? Now, again, I personally don't subscribe to having any evolution theory from that, but to somebody who's on that end, it could be good witnessing tool. Number 3, the reported behavior in thousands of abduction reports contradicts the hypothesis of genetic or scientific experimentation on humans by an advanced race. This one's really important, and in my book, Cherubim Chariots, I talk about this. This actually, I think, is one of the best evidences that we have. A lot of abductees have reported just horrific medical experiments being done on them. Really traumatic stuff. But when you look at what they're actually doing, they're usually putting an implant in, or they take a small amount of DNA out. That's something that even with our medical technology today, we could do that painlessly and without a patient even knowing. I mean, I've been put under anesthesia and I've had a hip replacement, so major parts of my skeletal structure have been taken out. I don't remember it because I was put under. I'm not traumatized by it. It wasn't a horrific experience. So why is it that these supposedly advanced aliens from other planets, they're so advanced yet they can't even, their medical program is lagging behind so much. So it's horrific. Number 4, the extension of the phenomenon throughout recorded human history demonstrates that UFOs are not a contemporary phenomenon. Now this is Ancient Aliens and shows like that have gotten a hold of this and have provided some type of answer. I think there's a better one than what they provide, but we'll be looking at that too. And again, in Cherubim Chariots, I go into that, especially the ancient Indian texts, which we'll be getting into. The apparent ability of UFOs to manipulate space and time suggests radically different and richer alternatives. That one is really important to our discussion today. That's talking about the extra dimensionality of some of these crafts. So we'll be getting into that. Based on eyewitness accounts, UFOs can come in a wide variety of shapes and apparent abilities. So it's not one size fits all, so not one explanation is going to fit for every single one. So we have 3 basic types of UFOs when we look at what people report. The first one is just a human-made advanced physical object with advanced tech, say government secret projects, things like that. People can witness those and maybe think that it's aliens or something, but it could just be our own government or some of the governments of the world. These ones aren't, these are the less advanced of the 3, but it's just human run, nothing alien about it. It's just advanced tech that we're not being told about. The second one, non-human made physical objects. I think this is the one that most people see, especially abductees. These are still physical objects. There's nothing extra dimensional about it. It's nuts and bolts craft, but they're created and piloted by non-human beings. If you want to call them aliens or fallen angels or whatever name you want to put on that, that's who created these. But it's still made from raw physical material. Now, whether these are made off-world or in underground bases or even bases on the moon, we have no idea. But that's what the second one is. I think that's what most people see. But by far the most interesting, and I think the most confusing, is the extra-dimensional object. This is something that may not have even been created. This is something that God may have created when he created everything. And that's going to be the main focus of this talk. So, extra dimensions. The best example I have ever heard to explain what an extra dimension is the analogy of flatland. If any of you are familiar with Chuck Missler, excellent researcher. He's the one that I first heard this from, but when I started doing my own research, I found out every physicist who talks about extra dimensions uses this because it's so effective. Basically, what flatland is, it was popularized by a novella. Edwin A. Abbott is the author in the 19th century. And again, every physicist uses this because it just works so well. So what is flatland? It's a hypothetical two-dimensional, and we're just talking about dimensions of space here, two-dimensional universe. So you can imagine it even on your tabletop or something. They have an x-axis and a y-axis, but no z-axis. There's no up and down. So the thought experiment goes, what if I, as a three-dimensional entity, wanted to communicate or show myself to a flatlander, a two-dimensional being who lives in flatland? If I were to stick my finger in there, what would that look like to a flatlander? Well, if you imagine what a two-dimensional slice of a finger would look like, as you're putting it in flatland, a flatlander would just see a point in his two-dimensional space appear before him, and it would grow into basically a circle. To him, because of his perspective, it would look like a line, but from our perspective, it would look like a circle. And as I'm pulling my finger out, he would see the whole thing in reverse, and it would disappear. Now imagine if I put two fingers in. It's the same thing, but twice. Now to the flatlander, those circles are going to look separate. They can move independently, do different things. The flatlander would assume that they're different entities. Now, if I kept doing that and kept putting my fingers in, they would see those two circles combine into one larger circle. And it would blow their minds, as it blows our minds when we see that in 3 dimensions. So that's a good thought exercise. We can also think of a sphere in flatland. If I were to drop a ball from our 3rd dimension, from the z-axis, into flatland, how would that look to a flatlander? Well, again, they would see a point in space just appear, and as the ball was going through flatland, they would see a circle get bigger and then shrink and disappear. Now, we can use that to try to not visualize, but maybe understand how an extra-dimensional object would look appearing in our space. So if you have what's called a hypersphere, it's a sphere of 4 spatial dimensions, and we're not talking about time. Time is the 4th dimension, but it all depends what context you're looking at it from. The 4th dimension of space, if a hypersphere from that higher dimension were to breach our space, it would be the same thing, just add 1 dimension. So we would see a point appear in space, but instead of a circle, we would actually see a ball, a sphere. It would get bigger as it was passing through, get smaller, shrink, and disappear. Now, that brings us to extra-dimensional unfolding, which this is going to play a huge part a little later on when we talk about Ezekiel's vision. Another way that you could get a flatlander to understand, or at least have as much information as possible about a 3-dimensional object, is you could unfold it. If I put a cube on flatlanders will just see a square. But if I unfold the cube, just as in the picture there, I can unfold it and they can see all 6 squares of the cube. Now, they're not going to be able to put together in their head what that's going to look like, but they'll at least have access to the most amount of information possible. So again, if we were to do that with what's called a hypercube, you could unfold that from 4 spatial dimensions into our 3 dimensions, which is sort of what that second image there is all about. It's impossible to draw something like that just on a 2-dimensional representation. But basically, what you would be left with is what's called a tesseract, and it's an unfolded hypercube. Now, that image on the far bottom right, it's a cross with 2 extra arms. There's no way that we're going to be able to look at that and construct what a hypercube looks like in 4 spatial dimensions. It's impossible. But it at least gives us the most amount of information possible in a perspective that we can understand. Okay, so another cool thing, another cool idea about flatland is flatland prison. This is a good thought exercise. Imagine if there was a flatland prison. One of the flatlanders is in prison. All another flatlander would have to do is essentially just make a circle around him. Now, from our perspective, it should be easy to escape because he could just climb out, but he would have to have access to the z-axis to do that, and flatlanders don't. So what could happen is I, or Albert Einstein there, could come up to flatland prison and pull the flatlander out into the 3rd dimension and then place him outside of prison. To the other flatlanders, it would appear that the one in prison just disappears out of prison and then reappears right next to it, and they would have no idea what happened. We might have some examples of things like that. Acts 12:7, and I'm going to have to go through this real quick because they are long passages, but basically Peter's jailbreak. That whole passage, if you read it, there's one strange verse that talks about how the handcuffs around Paul's wrist fell from his wrist. Now, I always pictured it that they just opened and fell off. But if this angel that was helping Peter escape was accessing the fourth dimension, and why wouldn't he? It would be incredibly easy for him, just as doing this would be easy for us. I actually think the handcuffs may have fallen through his wrists. We also get another example, Luke 24:36 through 39. That's where Jesus appears in the upper room, and nobody knows how he got there. And usually we think, well, maybe he walks through the wall, and in a sense that's right, but it would be the same as if we put a Flatlander back in prison. They're not exactly going through the wall, they're going around the wall in an extra dimension. So Jesus in his resurrected body may have utilized extra dimensions to do that. All right, ancient accounts from India. Now, right off the bat, as Christians, we look at these as historical eyewitness account. We don't get any spiritual discernment or anything from these. So some people I've met throughout my life have been opposed to looking at anything, historical and religious at the same time. But we're just looking at the history. I treat these as ancient eyewitness accounts that were misinterpreted because, think about it. If you're living a couple thousand years ago or a few thousand years ago and you see this big amazing thing, and this entity is telling you that he's a god, you're going to believe him. So I think that's part of what happened. Now in the Mahabharata, which is a Sanskrit text, there's a flying craft called the Pushpaka. And again, I want to backtrack just a minute. Another reason that I want to bring this into the conversation is because, again, shows like Ancient Aliens use this all the time, and it would be really good if Christians have a rebuttal. So, this is important. Now, the Mahabharata talks about the Pushpaka. Interestingly enough, an alternate meaning for that Sanskrit word can also mean serpent, which, yeah, so that's telling right there. Yeah. Now, the Pushpaka belonged to an entity called Vishwakarma, or a false god, or God with a little g, whatever you want to call it. He was regarded back then as the chief architect of the universe. And if anybody's involved in secret society type of research, that language will be familiar because Freemasons use that for the entity that they pray to. So that is telling as well. Now, something that we hear all the time in Ancient Aliens, shows like that, Vimanas. It's a big, hot topic nowadays. At that time, they were regarded as heavenly chariots or vehicles of the lowercase g gods. And actually, in the Bhagavata Purana, and these are quotes that I've heard proponents of the extraterrestrial hypothesis use to try to support aliens from another planet. But when you actually look at the text, and if you think of these in terms of being ancient eyewitness accounts, it actually supports the extra-dimensional hypothesis. The first quote here, "The Vimana flashed away into heaven beyond the stars like a thought, leaving a golden trail in the sky, which dissolved in a few moments and vanished above the perfect silence that had fallen on the gathering of the men on the earth below." The very first thing right there, the Vimana flashed away into heaven beyond the stars. So this is talking about something beyond physicality. If we're going to take this as a true eyewitness account, ETH doesn't explain that because it should be within the stars if it's from another planet. Another one here, "I saw devas fly down in the earth in their mystic vimanas, which are swifter than light." In three-dimensional physics, you can't go faster than light. It's impossible. You run into all sorts of problems, infinite mass, time travel, lots of different paradoxes. But if it's something extra-dimensional, that can help explain that. The third one here, and this one I think is the most telling of these three, it is talking about the Vimanas, which look like immense flying jewels cut like faceted discs, which fly more quickly than light or time. Now, this isn't just some modern translation that this is actually in the text. Cut like faceted discs and like immense flying jewels. That's like a perfect description of what a lot of UFO phenomena are reported as today. But that last part there, which fly more quickly than light or time. Now, again, we have something outside of time, something that's faster than light. It's got to be extra dimensional if we're going to take it as a true eyewitness account. And even with that, I'm not saying that we should. I'm just saying that the proponents of the extraterrestrial hypothesis do. So if they're going to follow through with that, I would challenge them to come up with an interplanetary explanation for this. Now, the people witnessing these things, I believe, they interpreted them based on what they saw and what they were being told by their culture and originally the false god themselves. So we have these fallen angels, and they tell people things, and it's not always the truth, especially if it's a fallen angel. It's not going to be the truth. They lift themselves up. They want to be higher than God, so they're going to tell people that they are. So that's why they're interpreted this way. Ancient Indian accounts are used heavily by subscribers of the ETH, especially within the Ancient Aliens crowd, to support their view of UFOs and their pilots. So moving on to Ezekiel's vision. And the ancient Indian stuff I think is interesting, but I think in our own Bibles we have something way more mind-blowing. Now, a basic rundown of Ezekiel's vision. Ezekiel's outside, he's praying to God, he's confused about his situation, he sees this amazing vision. And that's also a good determination of where we fall in this, because there are people that will say that it was just a vision, it's nothing physical, it's nothing substantial, it's just something in his mind. I don't believe that's true. I think that this actually was something extra dimensional, and again, something from God, the throne of God, the only true God of the Bible, that Ezekiel saw. Now, verses that show these cherubim melded together, that was basically what he saw. He saw these four beings, these four cherubim holding up the throne of God, and God was on the top. So I'm going to read through these really fast. Also out of the midst thereof came the likeness of four living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had the likeness of a man, and everyone had four faces, everyone had four wings. Their feet were straight feet. The sole of their feet was like the sole of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like the color of burnished brass. They had the hands of a man under their wings on their four sides, and they four had their faces and their wings. Their wings were joined one to another. They turned not where they went everyone straight forward. Okay, so there's a lot of information there, and we could take a whole day to unpack all that. But the main points that I want to focus on here is this type of melding effect that these cherubim seem to have. We read in verse 6 there, everyone had four faces, and everyone had four wings. And then in 7, their feet, plural, were straight feet, and the sole, singular, of their feet, plural, was like the sole of a calf. So the image that I get from that is it seems like they have separate legs, but they converge at some point into one thing. And we see that with the wings, too. Let me see where we at. Verse 8. Verse 9. Their wings were joined one to another. They turned not where they went, and everyone went straight forward. That word joined, it doesn't mean like in the Hebrew. You can go to Blue Letter Bible or anything like that and look it up, or use a Strong's Concordance. It doesn't give off the idea of something actually being bound, like with a rope or tape or anything like that. It's joined as in like melded, I think would probably be the best way to describe it. They were melded together in a way. Now I think Ezekiel saw a perfect living example of extra-dimensional unfolding. And the interesting thing too is if you picture that in your mind, they all four have their arms out and their wings, it kind of does make the shape of a tesseract. But what I think happened was these cherubim are extra-dimensional beings, and God wanted Ezekiel to see something, at least in terms that he could understand. So in a sense, these cherubim were unfolded into our third dimension of space. That's why we see those melding effects. Now, I've said this to a lot of people, there's no way anyone's going to convince me that 2,600 years ago Ezekiel knew enough about quantum physics to understand extra dimensions and make this up. But, I mean, proponents of the ETH will say stuff like that. He didn't make it up. He knew what he was, he just recorded exactly what he saw, even though he may not have fully understood all these little nuances that we can grasp today. Now, the wheels are interesting. In Hebrew, the word is ophanim, and usually it just means wheels. It's just the plural of ophan, which is wheel. It usually doesn't mean anything else but that. But here, in this context, it might actually be talking about a separate class of angel. It would be like the term flying saucer today. Technically I could take a plate out of my kitchen cabinet and I could throw it in the air. That's technically a flying saucer. But when people say they saw a flying saucer, in that context, that's not what they're talking about. So even though Ezekiel says he saw wheels, and he did see wheels, but it's not in the conventional sense like I saw wheels on this cart and I'm going to write a book about it. So we actually get a lot of information here. This is Ezekiel 1:15 through 21. Now as I beheld the living creatures, behold, one wheel upon the earth by the living creatures, and his four faces. The appearance of the wheels and their work was like unto the color of a beryl, and they four had one likeness, and their appearance and their work was as it were a wheel in the middle of a wheel. When they went upon their four sides, and they turned not when they went. As for their rings, they were so high that they were dreadful, and their rings were full of eyes round about them four. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went by them, and when the living creatures were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up. Whithersoever the spirit was to go, they went thither was their spirit to go, and the wheels were lifted up over against them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When those went, these went. When those stood, these stood. And when those were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up over against them, for the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. So lots that we could unpack, but the main thing that I want to focus on here is the last two verses at the end. It says, the spirit of the living creature, talking about the cherubim, was in the wheels. But from Ezekiel's perspective, the wheels and the cherubim are separate entities. Again, we might have a two fingers in flatland situation. If they're sharing one spirit, we might have something like that. And there's a lot more I could unpack, but it's all in my book, Cherubim Chariots. Okay, so the spirits of the cherubim were in the wheels. Could the wheels and living creatures be one and the same, just different parts? Possibly. And then Ezekiel wouldn't have been able to see where they connected because it's extra dimensional. Now, an unpopular theory in ufology is that of living UFOs. It's this idea that maybe some of these UFOs aren't actually mechanical, but actually have biology to them, a type of living creature, in a sense. Now, even though Ezekiel's vision of the wheels is a lot different than what's commonly reported, and again, I bring up Ezekiel because the Ancient Aliens crowd uses Ezekiel. And also, I highly recommend Michael Heiser's work on Ezekiel's vision. He wrote about it in Unseen Realm, and he's got a great presentation on YouTube. Definitely check that out. But they use that to try to say that he saw a UFO, like basically a silver disc, and the eyes were the windows, and he didn't know what he was seeing, or and it's all nonsense for many reasons that we don't have time to get into now. But even though Ezekiel's vision of the wings is quite different, or the wheels is quite different than what is commonly reported, it's possible some of the extra dimensional UFOs are actually alive in the same way that the cherubim and the Ophanim are. Now we know that there was a time where angels have fallen. That's all over in the Bible. That's happened. Now, is it possible that there are more than just the four Ophanim around the throne of God? Those are the good guys, but is there a larger class of Ophanim in heaven? And is it possible that some of them may have fallen in the rebellion? Maybe. And if that's the case, maybe some of that is mistaken for spaceships from another planet. Now, modern M theory today and don't let that scare you. That's a big, fancy, complicated word for just, there's a lot of dimensions beyond what we can see. But it states that there are 11 dimensions of space-time. Physicists will usually put space and time together now because time is a dimension, but it's also a property of space. But what's not often talked about is a possible foundational zeroth dimension. Imagine if the first dimension is the x-axis, so it's a line between 2 points, or it's a line from a single point spreading off infinitely into two directions. Well, before you have an x-axis, you have a point, and that's actually what a line is. It's just a series of points. So that foundational point is what's sometimes called the zeroth dimension. So if you add all that up together, you get 12, which can have all sorts of biblical meanings to it with the divine government, stuff like that. Now, if this is true, this actually might be represented in the faces of the cherubim. Now, there's a lot of explanation on what these faces mean, and a lot of them could be right. I prefer David Flynn's work. Mike Heiser's talked about it too. Mark Flynn, who actually wrote the foreword to Cherubim Chariots, is a great friend of mine, and he and I have talked about this too. So there might be different things at play here. And we have three passages that talk about these faces. We have Ezekiel 1:10, Ezekiel 10:14, and Revelation 4:7 that describe the four faces of the cherubim. Now the ox from Ezekiel 1:10, the ox face, that might represent the first spatial dimension, if this is what God had in mind at the time. Now I brought up Mark Flynn in his book, Forbidden Secrets of the Labyrinth, which is actually here at the Skywatch TV table. I highly recommend this book. It's one of the most eye-opening books I've ever read. He was able to show an actual circuit within the Hebrew alphabet that begins and ends with the ox. And I could spend 2 hours talking about that, but I won't because we don't have the time. But pick up his book. He lays it out really easily and it makes sense. Also, he was able to describe how the ox was used in ancient Israel. And here's a quote from this is actually from his blog, but he talks about it in his book too. The threshing floor in ancient times was a flat circular area of smooth rock where an ox or team of oxen would loosen wheat grain from the hard outer chaff. The method is still used today in places where modern machinery is not available. And there's a link up there. So if you're watching this on the DVD at home or through live streaming, you can go to that link to read the whole thing. Just go to Sirius Twins, SIRIUS twins.com. That's his website. Now, from the ox's perspective, the ox is going in a single direction continuously. Now, from our perspective, of course, it's a circle, and that's a two-dimensional object. But from the perspective of the ox, he's going in the same direction always. So this, included with Mark Flynn's research into Hebrew word pictures, that could give us our starting point, the first spatial dimension being represented by the ox. Now, the lion, I believe, could represent the second dimension. A lion has access to two dimensions in nature, but he doesn't have the z-axis, not like the eagle does. The eagle has the z-axis. It can fly, and it can go in all three dimensions. So the eagle might represent the third. Now, the fourth was tricky, and what was tricky about this is actually the man and the lion are interchangeable. And when you really read Ezekiel's vision, the way that he describes it, that cherubim, it was a single head, I guess, but it was bisected down the middle. Half of it was a lion and half was a man. And that's usually not picked up in the text, but if you read it carefully, that's what it says. And then it confirms it later on in Ezekiel. Dave Flynn had talked about that in his research too. And I think that is representing the fact that these two could be interchangeable. Now, I, for the sake of this discussion, say the man is the fourth dimension because we have a spirit. You know, we have a type of extra-dimensional existence to us. Now, just as easily, we could be the second dimension because we don't naturally have the power of flight, and the lion could be representing the fourth dimension because we read that Satan is a roaring lion who seeks to devour, excuse me, and being a fallen angel or fallen cherub, that is a extra-dimensional being. Even Jesus himself is referred to as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So those two are interchangeable, which is it's really interesting. So now we can move on to the next verse. That gives us our first cycle of four dimensions. Next verse, Ezekiel 10:4. This says, everyone had four faces. The first face was the face of a cherub. The second face was a man. The third face was a lion. The fourth face was an eagle. Now the ox here has been replaced by a cherub, which a cherub, again, is a true extra-dimensional being, thus representing a new cycle of four. And I always wondered that. Why is it a cherub now, but before, when Ezekiel described it, it was an ox? That might be why. Also, as we discussed with the extra-dimensional unfolding before, for cherubim to unfold into our dimension in that way, they would have to be at least fifth dimensional. Imagine if you take the tesseract shape. If you wanted to show a flatlander what a tesseract looks like, you could unfold it again but eventually you're going to start having squares that are occupying the same space. That's what we have with the cherubim and the wings and their feet. That they would have to at least be fifth dimensional. And if this is the second cycle, 1 + 4 is 5. So taking an order of mention, the cycle continues with the man, which would be the sixth dimension, which that makes sense. Because in biblical numerics, 6 is the number of man. Then you have the lion, which is the seventh dimension. And that has all sorts of meaning in the book of Revelation, especially if the lion does represent Jesus. And then we have the eagle, the eighth dimension. Now, we move to Revelation 4:7. And this is actually really cool because when John sees these cherubim, they're not melded. He's seeing them in their original habitat. So they're separated, they're separate beings. Now, because John is still a three-dimensional being, he's going to see it from a three-dimensional perspective. Just like if I take a flatlander out of flatland and into our dimension, he's still going to have a two-dimensional perspective. He'll see a lot more, but it'll just be all in his line of perspective. So John was dealing with the same thing. Okay, so we continue to the third cycle here, Revelation 4:7. And the first beast was like a lion, the second beast a calf, third beast had the face of a man, and the fourth beast was like a flying eagle. So if we take that from the last one, we have the lion as the ninth dimension, the calf, or what could be considered a repeat of the ox, in the 10th dimension. The man is the 11th dimension, and finally to the eagle, the 12th dimension. So what I think is interesting too is if this whole hypothesis is true, there's 3 cycles mentioned here, and it could be representation of God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, if true, if reality is really composed of 12 dimensions, and I believe it is, everything I've looked into has fit within that, it goes to show that God's creation is unimaginably complex, it's beautiful, it is full of strange entities who have the capability of interacting with us within our 3 spatial dimensions. I think heaven is going to be a lot stranger and frankly a lot more exciting than church usually tells us. I mean, there are angels who are wheels with eyes, you know. How often do you hear that in church? All right, so conclusion. Biggest question, why should Christians care? Again, we live in a day and age where real people are having real experiences with these entities, just like in the ancient past. The enemy's using different names, you know, now it's aliens instead of demons or, you know, or gods, you know, that word that they used before. So we exist in a world sort of with these things, and they're deceiving people. So it's up to us to provide an answer because no one else is going to. We've seen what the world does when it's called on to provide an answer. We get things like New Age theology and whatever you want to believe in that can just be true. And it's just not so. That is a path that leads people straight to hell, unfortunately. So we have to be the ones. That's why Christians should care. And it's, you know, I think it's the popular thing now when we hear of an abductee report, or if somebody says, I saw a UFO, you know, we might entertain the story, but, you know, sometimes we're thinking in the back of our heads, it's probably a plane or a weather balloon or something. I don't do that anymore. I used to, and I don't do that anymore. And it's not because I've seen anything. My wife has had an experience, and I believe her wholeheartedly, but I've heard too many accounts from too many different people that all fit within this same framework of extra dimensionality that I can't ignore it. I mean, I think that there is truth there. Of course, there's going to be people that make fake videos. There's going to be people that are trying to get on Coast to Coast or something, and they're going to have a fake story, or that's going to happen. But I don't believe all of them are lying, and I don't even think the majority of people are lying. So that's why we have to care. We have to make ourselves care about this because people's souls are at stake. And I'm talking to myself just as much as every one of you here. It's really important. Now, I do have a couple of books that get into quantum physics from a biblical perspective. The first one, Quantum Creation, and then the one where much of this information has come from, Cherubim Chariots. I've joked around on my own radio interviews. I think I'm a better writer than speaker. If this is over your head, that's okay. I promise it'll make sense in the book. I only have an hour or so to go all through this, and that's going to happen. Online information, feel free to email me at jpeck@skywatchtv.com. I work with/for Skywatch TV. It's an absolutely fantastic ministry, and I'm not just saying that because I work there. I believed that before I knew any of the people personally. And actually, my wife and I host a show, if you haven't heard of it, it's called Into the Multiverse. And it's basically this kind of stuff. It's this, we kind of try to take a little bit more time to make it accessible to as many people as possible. But I think really the key with a lot of this stuff is repetition. Because again, we live in a very scientific world that wants to make us believe, especially us Christians, that we're too dumb to get this stuff or we're not smart enough. And I'll be honest, I dropped out of college. I graduated high school with a 2.6. So, look, we have nothing to worry about with this. Science is accessible to Christians because it's the study of God's creation. It should be. He wants us to appreciate his creation. So at least the basics, it's understandable. So don't let the world tell you that you're not going to understand and you shouldn't even ask questions, because that's just a bunch of garbage. So you can, it's youtube.com/intothemultiverse. Please subscribe. It's very important. And also, Josh Peck Disclosure, it's my other YouTube channel. You can subscribe to that. I host a show called The Sharpening Report. It's a basic interview show. Website, sharpeningreport.com. My blog, joshpeckdisclosure.blogspot.com. And of course, most importantly, don't forget to check out Skywatch TV. You'll find me and a lot of other people on there talking about different things. They always have articles, fresh material pretty much every day. All right, so all that being said, thank you. Take care and God bless.